So thank you very much for that introduction. As Nura said, I formerly worked in kind of the homeland security sphere, doing work primarily on drug trafficking, human trafficking, illicit commodity chains that float across the southwest border. And that's really what got me interested both in the illicit commodity issue, as well as specifically in the women and drug trafficking issue. And as I was working basically face-to-face with the cartel war in Chihuahua back in the late 2000s, one of the things that I kept seeing were reports of women being arrested, women being killed, and generally women being mentioned in the same context as organized crime. And this seemed to be somewhat of a shift, and even talking to some colleagues that had been there much longer than I had, they also seemed to be a little bit perplexed by this. Why is it that every time you see a group of individuals from the Zetas drug trafficking organization or from the Crio Fuentes organization captured, you have 1, 2, sometimes half that are female? And so this kind of sparked the interest on this study. And so this is more of a working paper right now, and I should say too that with the group that we have here and the time that we'll have to talk, I also do a lot of work in Central and South America, West Africa, to a degree the Middle East, on human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, you name it, issues like that. So I'd be happy to talk about just about anything. We could even talk about Somalia and polio if anybody is particularly interested in that area. So this study, like I said, is a working paper. Has been going on for the last couple of years and is slowly winding its way towards publication, which hopefully should be quite soon. So one of the things that you found is that the role of women in Latin American drug trafficking organizations has really shifted over the last 8 years. You can see this partially reflected in the massive rise in incarceration in Mexico of women. It's up by about 400% in 3 years. And in some areas it's actually even more dramatic. The average incarceration rate for women in 2009 in all of Mexico was about 5%. If you look at one of the key drug trafficking states, Sinaloa, it was 25% of the prison population. And the prison population there is quite high, so this is actually really saying something. There are a lot of women that are being arrested. And you can see this throughout the rest of Latin America as well. This isn't restricted to Mexico. You find it in Guatemala, you find it in Honduras. To a degree, you even find it in the U.S., where women and girls in gangs are becoming an increasingly big issue. Now, the crimes that women are in jail for in Mexico are changing as well. So 10 years ago, in 2000, you found that most women were charged with crimes of passion, with killing a lover or doing something else in the heat of the moment. Now, 70 to 80% of the women that are in jail for some drug-related offense, the vast majority of them for dealing on the street. This is a rather dramatic shift, especially in the context of Mexico, where the traditional gender roles, at least up until very recently, frowned on women working outside of the house, and in many ways enforced a very gendered division of labor. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is that the shift, this increase in women in drug trafficking organizations, and you're finding they're shifting roles within the groups as well. They're no longer just the accountants. They're no longer just the dealers. They're no longer just the traffickers. They're increasingly the assassins. They're increasingly the leaders. They're increasingly these high-powered individuals within the groups. That shift is born both by necessity and by opportunity, by supply and by demand. And with the supply element, you find more women that are willing to take up these jobs, that are able to, because of shifting gender norms, because of economic need, work outside of the house. And also by shifting demand on the part of the cartels. They need a new profile in terms of their operations. The old sort of plaza-based system where it was violence and territorial control that got them money is starting to shift rather rapidly. They need people that are smart, that are able to move, that speak multiple languages. And in many cases, it's women that are fitting this bill. As well, it's indicative of professionalization professionalization and corporatization on the part of the DTOs. So they're shifting from family-based organizations into something else. So overall, I'd say what you're going to find by the end of this is that organized crime is changing. Success and fame are no longer as dependent on violence as what you know, on who you know, and which language you're able to speak to them in. So just to give everybody a background on this, to talk about men, gender, and drug trafficking. And the illicit narcotics industry has really historically been a male-dominated industry, or a masculinized industry is perhaps an even better way to put it. If you subdivide it down into its constituent parts, into production, transportation, and street-level distribution, production has historically taken place in the countryside, whether it be marijuana, coca, poppies. You find that the same sort of social norms that exist in the countryside that throw men up as the predominant agriculturalists are oftentimes replicated to an even more extreme degree within the illicit drug economy. At the transportation level, emerging from family organizations and gender kind of norms of who is out of the house, who's the larger businessman, you find that it's very gender segregated as well towards the masculine. There is space for women to operate, and I'll get into that in a second. Finally, at the sale level, at the sort of distributional gang, if you will, that has additionally been highly masculinized, though not necessarily as male-dominated as you'd think. And as one researcher noted, where the stakes are high and the risks are great, organized crime is highly sexually segregated. Now, really what you see within organized crime is that men adopt a highly masculinized role. It's protest masculinity. And what protest masculinity is an emphasis on violence. It's an emphasis on hypersexuality. And it's an emphasis on hyperaffluence. There's a reason that you find a lot of Scarface posters that are recovered from narco safe houses. It's an ideal up there. And you have to have that street masculinity in order both to gain respect as well as to act within the game, if you will. And you start to see this with the nicknames that individuals are given. Now, these are Mexican drug trafficking organization leaders. So you have the Executioner, the Most Crazy, Tony the Storm, the Barbie. The Barbie is a very good-looking guy. He apparently had much success with the opposite sex, and he was also a stone-cold killer. So you have violence. You have kind of an impetuous nature. You have sexuality, and then again you have violence. And these things tend to be repeated again and again and again. And so this is, and I'll get into women and gender in a little bit, but this is one of those things that has always been seen as a little bit of a bar. I mean, how as a woman do you go in and start to adopt these same sort of personas? Is it possible? And it turns out, in fact, that it is. But it doesn't necessarily need to be. So, with women, gender, and drug trafficking, women do actually have a long history of drug trafficking, at least in the Central American and South American context. If you look back at the very early days of the cocaine trade, or at least the illicit cocaine trade, the late 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you actually find a fairly large amount of women that were involved. You have some Chilean traffickers that were drawn in by their family. You have one Bolivian trafficker named Blanca Ibanez de Sanchez, who was extremely involved in setting up some of the initial pipelines out of Bolivia and up into the U.S. And then you had Grasilda Blanco, who's one of the people that actually, she's Colombian, coined the idea of putting an assassin on the back of a motorbike and using that as an assassination technique, and that was her calling card. So they played extremely key roles in the development of illicit cocaine trafficking, and also up along the border as well. You had a couple key female capos up there, but really there's been a little bit of a sublimation of their role. You find that the women ended up playing key roles in kind of harboring cartel members, providing food, transporting drugs when necessary. But they weren't doing the sort of jobs that we traditionally associate with transnational organized crime. They weren't doing the violence on the street. They weren't the flashy kingpin. They weren't the assassin. And so their role has tended to be relegated a little bit to the sidelines in history. And that's not particularly uncommon within the larger organized crime realm. You know, you look at, for example, with human trafficking, where women fit in there. And, you know, women are seen by some researchers as having a little bit more of a role to play in human trafficking because it's a little bit more of a gendered market, or at least that's one of the theories that's out there. You find that in Chinese human trafficking rings, women have a little bit more influence. In Nigerian human trafficking rings, especially the Nigerian Madame system, that brings young women from southwestern Nigeria up to Europe, it's almost wholly dominated by women, at least in terms of the organizational aspect. But yet, transnational organized crime, again, is seen as very much of a masculinized game. And one of the things that makes women like Griselda Blanco and Sandra Villa Beltran, who's actually one of the key connectors between Mexican drug trafficking organizations and some of the Colombian groups in the 1990s and early 2000s stand out, is because they are atypical. Now, that's actually starting to shift. So what leads women to drug trafficking? What leads women to enter in as couriers, as accountants, and the like? One, you have economic necessity. So increasingly in Central America, as economic situations have become grim, as livelihood opportunities have started to dissipate, and as traditional coping strategies, traditional familial structures that have allowed people to survive adverse economic climates before have started to lose their salience, started to lose kind of the social glue, the social capital that's kept them together. Drug trafficking becomes one of the more available opportunities, or some engagement within the illicit economy. Second, you actually have the fulfillment of traditional gender roles. Let's see. I actually lost my page too. There it is. So with a lot of women in Mexico and the rest of Latin America, you actually find that they get drawn into transnational organized crime by virtue of being a family member, a wife, a daughter, a mother of some other individual that's involved in organized crime. And this happens very frequently outside. So, I mean, Sandra Villa Beltran is, she was very intimately linked into several different family networks that facilitated this. This was her entry into kind of this arena in which trust facilitated the movement of drugs, and she was that key person that was able to do that. And one of the things that you find is that while men are motivated oftentimes by the economy and thrill of trafficking, for women it's really emotional reasons. You know, the social pressures that oftentimes grow up, with economic pressures being secondary. But one of the more interesting things out there is also the rebellion against traditional gender roles. And you find this with a lot of women that are in the middle and upper classes, wanting to react against a bourgeoisie upbringing. And they look out and, especially now, find that with narcocorridos, with some of the soaps, and sorry, narcocorridos are songs that are very popular in northern Mexico that glorify and often speak to drug trafficking in a very positive light. And it's kind of a very hokey version of gangster rap in many ways, but very interesting to listen to, especially if you really like oompa bands and that sort of music, which I do. I don't know what that says about me. So this sort of lifestyle is very much publicized. It's very much about power. And for a woman in the middle class or the upper class that doesn't have a lot of agency and power over her life, it can be a very seductive opportunity for her to exercise that. And looking at the history of women drug traffickers as well, there was a woman named La Nacha up in Ciudad Juarez back in the 1930s and 1940s that, interestingly enough, was actually drawn in by her husband into drug trafficking. He was killed. She went on to become one of the key capos that sold drugs to American soldiers. But still, down to the present day, her memory has resonated with some researchers reporting that in their interviews that they find that women are still citing her as one of the reasons that they want to go into this flashy lifestyle. They want the power, they want the money, they want the AK-47 and all the thrills that go with it. And so this is the way to break out for them. Now, it's important to say too that there's also coercion involved in all of these. The economic angle is perhaps most visible with that. If you need money and you don't have any other way of earning it, you're likely to go into street-level distribution. And in fact, sort of about 70 to 80% of the women in Mexican jails are in for. And that's an incredibly risky place to be. You know, you're opening yourself up to violence not simply from customers, not simply from the police, but also from members within your own organization. And there are certain strategies that have to be adopted in order to lessen the likelihood of that. But even in the rebellion against traditional gender roles, you find that once you get into an organization, you know, it might be fun to get in on a lark, but getting out can be incredibly, incredibly difficult. You had one woman that was recruited actually in the U.S., in Laredo, 21 years old. When she was 17, she'd been sent off to a Zetas training camp. Had thought that it was going to be really fun and interesting, but she found that she couldn't get out until she was arrested. She was in fear that if she tried to walk away, that the Zetas would come and kill her family. And so it may be one thing to get in, but to get out, there's a tremendous amount of coercion and non-opportunity involved. Now, this gets us to some elements of those gender norms, so leveraging and coping with gender. So to what degree do you find that women in Mexican drug trafficking organizations or Latin American drug trafficking organizations play on traditional gender norms? The sweet, innocent girl that would not be involved in drugs to save her life, versus actively try to subvert them. And especially if you're on the street dealing, you find that coping with these norms is actually more important than leveraging them. So leveraging norms, as I kind of just hit on, the gendered expectations of innocence. And this is most key for smugglers, whether they're going cross-border or within Mexico, within Latin America these days. Cross-border, you find actually very frequently that women, young women, old women, sometimes very, very old women, are favored by drug traffickers because the border guards in the U.S. will not expect that they'll be transporting drugs. They'll be less likely to suspect, less likely to be suspicious. And so even if it's only a marginally larger opportunity to move narcotics across the frontier, the line of control, they'll do that. And then you actually find this extend up into the upper class too. So there have been a couple busts of high society women from Monterrey, which is a very wealthy city in northern Mexico, that kind of for fun, kind of for spending money, were running drugs to Houston. Didn't work out particularly well for them, but it shows kind of the draw of this culture. And you know, you look at some of the leaders in drug trafficking organizations, female leaders, and they actually play on gender roles as well. There's not a huge amount of masculinization to them. They still very much look like high society women within the Mexican cultural context. But that's then counterplaced against coping with the norms. And you actually find this in other sorts of organized crime as well, in which women have to deal with an often violent male cohort. And how do they do that? The first way is through desexualization. And as research has shown, whether in gangs, street-level distribution, smuggling, assassins, you find a lot of women that seek to consciously strip off their feminized self. Some have mentioned putting on weight. Some have mentioned being hyper-aggressive, trying to make it look to the boss, to the other individuals that you're dealing with, that you shouldn't be looked at as a woman. You should be looked at as just one of the guys. And in fact, one of the traffickers said, as soon as they no longer see you as a girl, then you can be friends with the big guys. That goes hand in hand with violent posture. So you don't necessarily find women more likely to utilize violence, but you see oftentimes the projection of latent violence as a tactic towards surviving, within this hyper-masculinized world. You have an emotional detachment. So when people say things to you, when people make jokes, when people hit on you or make derogatory comments, you find a lot of women that have been involved in these roles saying, you just can't let anything on. You can't show that, you're impacted by it at all, because that diminishes your persona on the street, and that really, really impacts what it is you're doing. And then finally, professionalization. You find a lot of women really focusing on being the best that they can be in the sale of whatever it is that they're selling. And they have to do that. Whereas men may simply be able to cope and rely on brute strength or latent violence or actual violence in order to corner a market. You find that professionalization by women is what gets them in contact with the big boys, with those wholesale distributors, that enables them to then form these partnerships of trust that give them some protection and also access to product and the ability to continue operating for a long amount of time. So there, yeah.
Can you explain violent posture? I don't think I understood that.
Sure. So violent posture is essentially, it's not the use of violence per se, but it's latent violence. It's almost the threat of violence. So for example, it's the inspiring of fear.
Okay.
Doesn't mean that you actually have to hurt somebody. Kind of think of a high school. You find a lot of people that have various postures that they adopt. Goth, or I'm dating myself by this quite obviously. It doesn't necessarily mean that they buy into everything there, but it is something for show to enhance their public persona, to put out some sort of public image. And with male norms as well, again, this might not be how the guys truly are. There is an acclimatizing aspect that if you live the Tony Soprano idea for long enough, you might well end up as probably a very less successful version of Tony Soprano. But still, these are roles that are self-created and created through kind of the market. And it is a little bit different in human trafficking. I'd be interested to get your point of view on that. But the idea of protection, the idea of wanting your cargo, wanting your product to trust you. I mean, you don't have that problem with cocaine. Cocaine will go with you wherever. But if you, especially as the first rung on a distribution chain or the first rung on a human trafficking chain, don't project an aura of being able to care for somebody, it makes it a little bit more difficult. So we can talk about this a little bit more in question and answer. So that actually brings us up to, how have women's roles changed? As I noted before, you're increasingly finding that women are becoming enforcers, spies, and leaders within drug trafficking organizations. The picture that you have under enforcers, those 4 young ladies right there, all of them are under the age of 17. They were picked up at a Zetas training camp. And one of them, in fact, got up in front of the cameras at one of these kind of post-bust press conferences that Mexican authorities frequently do. She was like, "Yep, I'm an assassin. Been trained as an assassin for the last couple of days. I'm making 12,000 pesos a month, which is about 3 times the average salary in Mexico." And she was very cheerful about the entire thing. Incidentally, there were 6 people that were picked up at this camp, and 4 of them were women. And this is not something that is particularly surprising. You find increasingly that the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, groups that operate in the east of Mexico, are very consciously incorporating women into the fold. It seems to have started off very much with the Zetas, bringing women in either as enforcers, as spies. They have an entire unit called the Leopards that are formed of prostitutes that they then utilize to extract information out of military officers, police officers, anybody else coming in. And then also leaders. So you have La Flaca, the skinny one, over on the right. And I apologize, you probably can't see that picture very well. But she ran a small plaza outside of Monterrey in Nuevo Laredo. Or Nuevo Leon, sorry. And she is one of 14 women that are believed to be plaza bosses in Mexico. And this is traditionally very atypical. So a plaza is a distributional area for drugs. Sometimes it's a transportational area for drugs. And you find these women are starting to work their way up within the hierarchies of Mexican drug trafficking organizations. And so, this started off as a Zetas thing. Increasingly, you're finding, like I said, that it's a Gulf Cartel thing. And they were organizations that were very closely related until they split. And with the Gulf Cartel, a lot of commentators have been looking at it, and the Gulf Cartel has been in bad straits for quite some time. And they said, this is necessary. There's been high levels of attrition of your male personnel. And so they're turning to women as a way to replace that. Which, that in part may be correct. But to a large degree, it's actually more complex than that. You have this occurring in many other groups throughout Mexico. Again, the Zetas. You have this occurring within the various groups that are active in Michoacan, so kind of down in the south. The Knights Templar and the La Familia organization that preceded it. You had women that were actually used as producers in methamphetamine production. You had women that are utilized to get information. And so there's some other aspect at play. And I would argue that the aspects that are really at play involve, one, yes, attrition. But really it's professionalization and economics that bring it up. And so in the attrition angle, you've seen a lot of the men that previously kind of composed the lower and mid-ranking brackets of the drug trafficking organizations arrested or killed over the course of the cartel conflict, and it's been about 8 years now. You've had well above 70, 80,000 men that have been arrested over that time. And so women compose the group that's left. Now, you also have professionalization. And this professionalization, and I alluded to it earlier, is a shift in the nature of drug trafficking organizations in Latin America, and specifically in Mexico. And it's no longer simply an endeavor in which you need to control territory along the U.S.-Mexico border or along lines of control in the interior to move product. Increasingly, these groups are active in West Africa, they're active in Europe. There's some indication that they're active in China now, which is rather fascinating. And so there's an entirely new skill set that's necessary. The same theorist that came up with the idea of gendered markets noted that the perception on her part was that gendered markets arose because violence was not salient to human trafficking, or not as salient to human trafficking as drug trafficking, and international networks were quite vital. And increasingly you're finding that international networking piece to be quite vital. You need individuals that are able to speak multiple languages, and you find that in some of the female drug traffickers, for example, in Europe. There's some that become the key points of contact for, say, their Moroccan husband or Moroccan boyfriend, and consumers in the Netherlands, wholesale distributors in England and Ireland. And so they actually act as the fulcrum that allows the entire endeavor to expand. As well, there's an element of restraint that's necessary. So whole-scale bloodletting and whole-scale violence is well and good, but it's intensely disruptive to business. And at the end of the day, these groups aren't looking to overthrow the state. They're not looking to have a failed state out there, quite simply because that's bad for business. It's a pain to have to replicate what it is that a state provides if you don't need to as a business organization. And these guys don't deal drugs because they like drugs. In fact, some of the more successful drug traffickers are teetotalers. They deal drugs because it's high value. And so women are able to, at least according to some of the theorists, hold off on the indiscriminate use of violence marginally better than men. And use violence when violence is necessary, but yet not use it all the time. Not have the Tony the Storm or the most crazy, this big question mark in the middle of your organization. What will they do in this situation? If you're trying to structure a transnational empire, a transnational business empire, the Coca-Cola of cocaine, you want somebody that you know exactly what they'll do, and they'll exercise very good judgment. And then finally, there's the economics part. And again, this comes down to supply and demand. And I just talked about the demand. Drug traffickers seemingly want to increasingly bring women into the fold. There's also a large supply due to both economic challenges as well as the high pay that you can get with drug trafficking organizations. And if you can get 3 times the average monthly salary for just being an assassin, you can get massively higher for being a middle range operator or above. And there's a supply of people that will do that. I mean, drug trafficking is more, and other forms of trafficking, human trafficking, really what they are at heart is deviant globalization. They're not people that are doing bad things because they really get a kick out of bad things. They're people doing bad things because this is the way that they can best support themselves and best achieve a lifestyle that they want. It's kind of a similar question to why do you find that overwhelmingly that's the people that live on marginal incomes in the U.S. that gamble or that play the lottery. It's not because they haven't thought about it. It's because this is the most practical way for them to get rich. And it's similar here. This is the most practical way for them to earn the livelihood that they need for their families. But there also is an impact to that. So traditionally within the organized crime realm, and you see this in the American Mafia, you see this in kind of criminal groups throughout the world, there's a very strong taboo on the targeting of women, to the degree that it's actually shocking when it occurs. And when women are targeted, oftentimes they've been family members of major organized crime lords. The first beheading in Mexico took place in 1989 when the wife of an imprisoned drug lord was seduced by a Venezuelan trafficker, taken to San Francisco, forced to, or convinced to withdraw all of her husband's money, and then killed. I won't tell you what happened with that beheading, but suffice to say it was pretty ugly. But you've increasingly seen women becoming victimized by the drug trafficking conflict. And that's both as members of the trafficking groups themselves, as somewhat celebratory killings, as what you saw with the women in Juarez throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. And then also as members of law enforcement and government officials, which is also an interesting element of increasing opportunities for women in Mexico. It's not simply in the drug realm. It's also in places that formerly were far more difficult to access, such as the police force. And that's led to a fairly large number of killings. So in 2008, you had about 4% of victims in the drug trafficking conflict that were perceived to be women, and that spiked, almost doubled by 2009 before leveling off in 2012. And this is likely to continue to stay at a steady rate, if not increase. And already you're starting to see that violence in Central America, in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, is following a similar route, where women are increasingly becoming victimized, kidnapped, killed, because of the association with organized crime.
Do you have the absolute numbers on those?
I'd have to go back to my notes, but I could probably.
I just don't know if it's like tens or hundreds. Or...
Yeah. No, I mean, we're not talking tens of thousands. Usually that would probably be like 40 to 50.
Yeah.
If not a little bit. Yeah. So, yeah, and with that, I'd love to take your questions.
Great.
So try to keep this short and sweet and.
No, this was fantastic. I mean, since we're a small group, do you guys want to introduce yourselves before we start discussion? I have a ton of questions, but I'd like to make it as much of a discussion, since this is our advantage of being a small group. So if you guys would like to go ahead and introduce themselves, ask some questions.
I work at Apple Associates, and I'm doing a human trafficking. I work on a human trafficking transnational crime project.
Oh, great.
And
And drug trafficking. Yeah.
I also work at APT. My name's Kamala Smith, and I work on the human trafficking and transnational organized crime.
And APT is, sorry, I didn't...
APT is a research and evaluation consulting firm,
Oh, great.
and we're based in Cambridge, right by LA.
Oh, cool.
We also have offices in Bethesda and Atlanta and Durham.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And across the world, too.
Yeah, we have some international project offices. But Mike Shively, do you all know Mike Shively?
Yeah.
Okay, well, he's the one that told us about this, because I think he's on like the listserv.
Yeah,
Oh,
this is
cool.
Whatever
great.
this is. So,
Yeah.
he sent us here today to take notes for our team.
That's
Oh,
great.
cool.
Yeah, so we're going to be bringing information back.
All right, well, I look forward to providing more.
Yeah.
So we can ask lots of questions.
If you can, yeah, I don't work for APT. You guys are pretty smart to work
Well, I don't know about that.
I come here for just about anything on human trafficking. So
Cool.
My gateway.
that's right. Yeah, well,
Do you guys want to start with questions? Does anyone, or should I go ahead?
I do have one thing I was curious about. I thought you mentioned earlier that women will be overly aggressive sometimes. Then you said the women are also better at using violence sparingly.
So that's violent posturing versus the actual employment of violence. So it's the threat of violence. It's the inspiring of fear rather than needing to use violence all the time. So it's not 100% the same thing. And the restraint is actually important. Like if you can terrorize somebody and achieve your goals like that, that can be far more effective than having to kill them. I mean, it's kind of like the corruption question, right? So if you look at what's preferred for organized crime groups, corruption or coercion, and violent coercion at that. So, like, do I kill you, or do I bribe you? You know, what's better for human trafficking? What's better for drug trafficking? What's better for an illicit commodity? I'd actually argue that it really is corruption because it allows, if I bribe you, I can start to plan my business relationship. I can start to be sure that there's a price that I'm going to pay you. You're going to let X amount through, and then as a businessman, that's good. If I kill you, somebody's going to come and replace you. They might be a little bit more scared, but then I'm going to be faced with the same conundrum. Do I kill you or do I corrupt you? And you can't go on ad nauseum. Because if you go on ad nauseum, then at some point in time, whatever government is going to realize that there's a problem and is going to react against you. And plus there's a high level of instability in that kind of transactional relationship, as limited as it might be. And so it's the same thing with fear. You know, fear can work in tandem with corruption, but just as well as corruption.
I live a pretty boring life based on this, but I'm beginning to like my boring life. The women who posture violently, I've met those women, they are pretty scared. They can start yelling at you on the street. Anytime they take a picture of a child and she doesn't like it.
Yeah.
They can get scared. And I wonder why the good people have never used those women. Why is it always the bad people who use those women?
That use them? Yeah. That's a good question.
Have you ever seen good people
Have I ever-
such women?
Well, you can see violent posturing, I'd say, in a variety of, for men and women.
I'm sorry.
I mean, it's something that comes up in the military and with women's security forces.
Yeah.
You see some of the same tactics of desexualization, a posturing of, you know, kind of preemptive. It's almost like, you know, how if you put already a kind of demeanor of being someone who's tough, then
Yeah.
you're preempting possible threats of people actually. So it's these are common tropes that we see.
I get in the
with
military,
women.
but like in domestic violence law in India, the women get together to talk about it, essentially. None of them say, let's go meet that son of a bitch husband of yours and see what we can do with it. But on the drug trafficking side, the brothel owners are all mostly women.
I mean,
you stay away from them.
Yeah, I mean within brothels, within kind of sexual trafficking, especially when human smuggling transfers into human trafficking. And what I mean by that is when you move from a voluntary transactional relationship to go from point A to point Z, and then become subject to force, fraud, or coercion, and subject to the desires of the individual that formerly was contracted to move you, whether that be for money or something else. Oftentimes, the method employed to deal with people might involve some small-scale use of violence. So if you have somebody that is really acting against being moved into trafficking, especially if you're dealing with a large group, there's violence exercised against them, but then for the rest of the group, it's latent violence, it's violent posturing that ends up bringing them, as horrible as this sounds, bringing them into your will and allowing you to continue to exercise it. Especially with human trafficking, if your goal is not to kill the person. It might be to hurt them fairly severely, but if you kill them, you're losing what, you're losing your investment, your money. That does sound really horrible, and I'm sorry for that, but it's true, yeah.
So can I ask you, where are you thinking of publishing? I would love to read the paper if you're interested in.
Yeah, no, that'd be fantastic. I actually haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah.
I've got like a backlog of papers right now.
Yeah. And this is based on fieldwork in what?
This is basically based on kind of a large review of data and media,
Yeah.
as well as some field work. Not a large amount of it. And so I'll be going back down to Mexico, back to Nicaragua, I think probably back to Honduras and El Salvador this coming year.
So this is a prelim kind of one of the first articles that comes out of this dissertation project. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So my dissertation itself looks at the development of drug trafficking routes in the 1980s and 2000s. So how do drug trafficking routes in Central America and Mexico get structured? How do they get put together? Understanding the trust networks that build up, and how do you form a trust network? Which is actually very similar to human trafficking.
Yeah.
How do you hand people off?
And it's great because I was going to ask you, it seems like the question underlying the talk was, well, what's driven the shift?
Yeah.
And in the end, we get the answer of attrition, professionalization, economics. And it's funny because when you talked about professionalization both in the beginning and in the end, I sense that that's where the argument really is.
Yeah.
And I wonder if maybe it's not really professionalization, because when we talked in the beginning and we talked about, well, what has caused a change in the shifting pattern in organized crime, the pattern you were talking about was actually the difference between territorial security and kind of population legibility or population security.
Yeah, yeah.
And that seems like a much kind of broader enforcement shift we're seeing internationally. So it seems to me that the timing here is perfect for talking about how women can actually get through, because increasingly we're not just doing borders, we're not doing security just at borders, right? It's within the domestic sphere, national identity documents, being able to track people.
Yeah.
And so I think that might be an interesting take when you're framing this for an article to think about.
I like
that aspect of it, but I don't want to put in theories that don't fit into the work. But
no. I mean, I think with all this, what I very strongly believe in this might be both my academic bias because I've spent years of my life working on this, but also my professional bias because kind of professionally this is what I've been face to face with since the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
But I look at kind of non-state armed groups and sub-state security challenges as kind of following kind of a long wave approach. So with terrorism, for example, you started off in the late 19th century, early 20th century with anarchist terrorism. And then that slowly morphed into kind of communist liberation movements, throughout, and that was primarily insurgency before moving into a more religious angle in the latest element. And so what's the security challenge that we're going to face in the coming 30 or 40 years? And this seems to operate on kind of that basis. And I think all the big trends that I see out there, urbanization, the decline of kind of monolithic states that are capable of adequately policing the entrance and egress of people and commodities from their borders, and the increasing opportunities for commercial non-state actors. So, why would somebody at this point in time rather be the president of, say, Honduras or the president of Coca-Cola? And why? 40 years ago, it probably would have been, especially if you're Honduran, probably would have been Honduras. Now there's a different element of status and a different element of financial recompensation that's involved. And so I think that this shifts around the calculus of what organized crime means for people and what opportunities they have. I apologize. What's your name again?
Jared.
Jared. So Jared and I were talking before everybody came in about essentially this question of routes, and this entire this connection between point A and point C, Eastern European organized crime, and why it is that it's kind of becoming more and more powerful. And do they represent a new opportunity for those people that are disenfranchised in Eastern Europe? I think they do. I think that for those people that are very smart out there, they can then take that and bank on it. I mean, I remember my father, who was a teacher in the U.S., had a foreign exchange student from a former Soviet country that I will not name because this is being taped. But he talked to her a couple of years afterwards and found out that she'd been sent to law school. But she'd been sent to law school by an organized crime group. And the idea was that when she came out, when she was a lawyer, she'd work for them. And people have the opportunity to do that. The number of people that come out of Fletcher, or come out of Kennedy, or come out of Harvard Law School, or come out of HBS is massive every year. I mean, relative to everything. We presume they're going off to do good. We hope they're going off to do good. But trafficking groups, illicit commodity groups, have the opportunity to hire them on simply because they can offer incredibly high salaries. And again, it's not a moral issue. Uruguay just decriminalized and legalized marijuana. So in the U.S., it's morally taboo to use marijuana, officially. In Uruguay, it's okay. And this is kind of these are the questions that we're going to be increasingly facing over the coming years. I mean, is it morally wrong if you're a Uruguayan lawyer to be involved with a group from Uruguay that's producing and then selling marijuana into Brazil where it's taboo? Right. Are you a bad guy, or are you just a lawyer? So.
You're a bad guy.
Yeah.
Before you cut it. You can cut it up any way you want.
Yeah.
Do you have any more questions?
I had a question just from, so when, I think the things that you talked about that are bringing more women into the drug trafficking organizations. There was one, I think, that maybe was in the email about militarization. Does that have more to? Is that more along the lines? Is that within professionalism and like training women in these different roles, like to be enforcers and spies and things like that?
It's especially the enforcer role. I mean, that's kind of the interesting thing is that there have been rumors for years and years and years that drug trafficking kingpins were developing units of incredibly good-looking young women that would be equipped with a small handgun and capable of getting very close to a rival drug lord and killing him. Which makes sense, again, playing on gendered expectations of innocence. You don't expect that, or at least until I read this, I didn't expect that a beautiful young lady would come up and assassinate me. Now I'm much more freaked out. But it's that move towards assassins that's become particularly interesting, and not simply like assassins under the command of some sort of male capo, but actually the tough one, Midea Kim. She actually commanded her own squad of assassins. They were responsible for, I think it was about 20 murders. It was a mixed group of men and women, very, very violent. And again, you can see kind of a desexualized, approach. And this might also be because she just was arrested and came from jail, and I think before that a firefight, so it's difficult to put oneself together. But you're finding that replicated in many other areas. And the traditional family-based codes, and again, family is often, they're difficult things to break through, because family-based organized crime groups, as with family-based businesses, are very, very, very traditional. This is the way that we do things, and one sense of self is not simply bound up in the business, it's bound up with the family, and so it all kind of comes together. When you start to get to groups like the Zetas that emerge from a very different trajectory, they're able to do things in a little bit of a different way because they're looking for operational returns. And so moving towards teenage girls, moving towards women, moving towards leaders that unless you had intelligence that that this woman was leading a plaza, you probably wouldn't stop her on the street. It'd be very different if you spied, like, this guy on the street, or this guy. There might be a little bit more hesitation on the part of the police there. So it's very, and incidentally, this actually formerly was the leader of the Jefas. So, this is one of those things where you find a different trajectory, a corporatization, a professionalization that enables different operational tactics and I'd say optimal outcomes in many ways. I think that also a lot of the drug trafficking organizations in Mexico have realized that brute force, especially in a time of incessant government crackdowns, is not the way to best protect their their business, their empire. So you have to turn to new things. And I should say that this isn't being adopted by everybody. For example, the Sinaloa Federation, which is another big group in Mexico, has seemingly far fewer women working in these new roles, even as it maintains a very healthy number of women working in other roles, such as accountants, such as traffickers, moving drugs across the line of control. They're moving drugs within Mexico. So it's very dependent by organization.
This was great. Again, I mean, there are more things that we can talk about, but I'd love to read the paper if you
Sure, yeah.
want to share it, and I think you should definitely try to publish it because there are a lot of gems, especially, even, I mean, in terms of like categorizing and marking the shift.
Yeah.
I think it is important because we don't think about the gendered way.
Not
And
at all,
also,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not really sure if it aligns here, but what you were saying about the international drug chains and international trafficking chains, at least in the chains that I was looking at when I was doing my field work in the Gulf, it was the exact same chains, often used for remittances and drug trafficking and arms trafficking and human trafficking.
Yeah.
The same networks get recycled. So
Where in the Gulf were you looking?
I was looking at Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Jeddah, and Riyadh.
Okay.
So a little bit all over.
Because I just put together a paper and kind of smoothing off the end of it that looks at organized crime in Syria,
Oh, great.
both historically and at present, but really with a look towards trafficking.
Yeah.
So in part, the trafficking of narcotics from the Mandate period through to the formation of, or the formal independence of the state, and then also the government interaction with that. So the taxation of trafficking flows versus the actual direction of trafficking flows, and how that's then spiraled into the Civil War period.
Oh, fantastic.
So did you look at anything going towards the middle?
From Syria. What are you using as sources?
A large number of. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
This has been fantastic.
It's pretty exciting. Real good to see you again.
Very
Thanks
good
for
seeing
doing
you.
this.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
So a lot of sources from the Mandate period through 2008 involve either newspapers, declassified data, stuff from the Foreign Office. I mean, if you look at British Foreign Office stuff,
Usually it's a gold mine. Yeah.
it's a gold mine, but you find out just how catty they really were.
Oh, yeah.
It was very funny. And then at present, it's basically a lot of documentation. I mean, getting in and talking to the smuggling clowns along the Syrian border would be. This is kind of the really difficult thing with the dissertation work that I do is to what degree can you actually get in? Like, so let's talk about your drug trafficking.
Yeah.
So have
Please.
you been actually, when you're talking about the field work that you're doing, are you actually sitting down and interviewing people, or what does that look like?
Yes, but not, especially for my IRB committee that might be watching this, not sitting down and talking to people that are imprisoned or vulnerable in any way.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is talking to former government officials, to researchers, to journalists.
Police officers.
police officers. Yeah, it's a lot of that. But because really what I'm looking to do is put together theory more than anything else. In some ways I have a little bit of an easier time because I can focus on theory generation and then put that out there for some enterprising and highly risky or risk-averse or non-risk-averse young PhD student to go test out. To a large degree what I look at is so it's the formation of these networks, but then also their impact on the political. So kind of what I was talking about before with the question of, what do people want now? Do people want to maximize their kind of political opportunities, or do they want to maximize their economic opportunities? And it doesn't necessarily need to be zero-sum, but in a situation of with a grinding lack of economic opportunity and a grinding lack of political representation, which actually includes many countries out there today, oftentimes it is zero-sum. You can either join a rebel organization or a gang. You can't do both.
It would be really interesting, actually, if you have the figures eventually to see whether the shift in the percentages of women in the gangs is different, significantly different than the just general shift of women moving
into other occupations.
Into other occupations,
Yeah.
but particularly the security occupations. I would look at like military and
That's a really good
police,
point.
just to see if that's like a control. Like, is this exceptionally?
Because that's another kind of high risk.
Or just women moving into roles that were traditionally seen as more masculine.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think that's a stellar idea. No, I really like that. Into security services.
Do you guys have any more questions?
No, not really. That was
Cool.
really
That was really
interesting.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming. Thanks.